चलो हैरी
to be missed. Titled 100 Years of Indian Literature, the Past, Present and Future of Our Fiction, the session shall witness author and veteran publisher David Davidar and journalist, author and the director of the Kolkata Literature Festival, Sujata Sen, discuss the trajectory of Indian literature over the last century. May I please invite our panelists onto the stage.
Welcome to the Kolkata Literature Festival, David.
Thank you.
And
Great
welcome
to be here.
to Kolkata Book Fair. I do hope you'll have some time to go around the book fair after attending a few sessions. Is this your first visit to the Kolkata Book Fair?
No, it's probably the 20th or the 25th, but not in this location.
Okay,
I mean,
so
I went to the one at the Maidan every year.
Right,
I go to it every
right.
year.
So this is now called the Book Fair Ground, Borimala Prangon, and we are very proud that we have a book fair ground all of our own, a book fair ground, and with all these traffics and police in the evening and difficult to get here, just shows that people love books, and that's why they are coming. So, congratulations for this brilliant anthology. It will be
Thank you so
launched
much.
later. It is just a beautifully anthologized collection of stories. So, big congratulations for doing this, David. So, you have written about it in the introduction. What is the rationale behind the anthology and who you have chosen? But it will be nice to hear it from your own, in your own words here. So, what is the rationale behind this anthology? Who have you chosen and how have you chosen them?
Well, a bit of background. I mean, the reason I think this session is entitled 100 Years of Indian Literature is contemporary Indian literature is only slightly over 100 years old. You know, I mean, it was the first wave of Indian writers started writing in the mid to late 19th century, and now we're in the first quarter of the 21st century. So that's the span in which modern Indian literature has been created, and that's always been an interest of mine. Obviously, because literature in India is created in, literally over 1,000 languages. We see only a very small glimpse of it. So what I was always interested in was, trying to do a kind of selection of the best of the literature I read. This is actually a successor volume to a book I published about half a dozen years ago called A Clutch of Indian Masterpieces, which looked at the greats from the 19th century to, that book. And then, it seemed to me that the time was right because to have a successor volume which looked at writers under 40, because it contains within it two cohorts. One is the millennial generation, and the second is Generation Z, which has just come of age. So essentially, this second book, the book that has just been published, has the best writing that I could find of writers under the age of 40, and because they are the future of Indian literature. Obviously, because of a dearth of quality translations, I couldn't it isn't exactly representation of all the literatures that fiction is created in, but I think it's a fair indication of what the future holds.
So, one thing that I'm very interested in, which you write in your introduction, is about your meeting with the editor of Granta. In my previous job, we have helped launch all the Granta new editions, and I have a very soft corner for Granta and the philosophy and the ethos behind Granta. So, what happened in that interview with Granta? Why was it important in your being an anthologist?
Well, the thing is, literature will be created by writers no matter what. Writers write. But unless there's a connection between writers and readers, it will tend to remain hidden under a bushel. And that's what magazine editors, editors of literary magazines, publishers, literature festivals do. They tend to make the connection between the writer and the reader. Now that connection could be electric or it could be dull. And what Bill Buford did many years ago, I think he's retired now from magazine editing, was he was a student at Cambridge and he got hold of a defunct literary magazine called Granta and reinvented it. He was an American, so he had all the kind of brashness and the kind of gung-ho attitudes of the Americans, coupled with the kind of rather more staid characteristics of the British. Whatever the varying qualities that he brought together made Granta a force to be reckoned with when he was the editor of Granta. What he did was he packaged and showcased literature in ways that had not been seen in a long time, or perhaps never. And so it became very fashionable to read Granta and get acquainted with many voices that you might otherwise have not heard about. So I was keen to meet this man because I was starting out in publishing at that point, and I wanted to know what he looked for in great writing. Now, I think all of us have our own impressions and ideas of what constitutes great writing, and there are certain inalienable sort of characteristics it must possess. I mean, the writer needs to, for example, not be a complete idiot. It needs to have some grasp of style, should have read enough to not be ignorant of some of the basics of what constitutes great writing. All of that is the foundation. On that you build the edifice of your literature, and it could be whatever it is depending on your individual talent. But as an editor, it's easy to discard the rubbish. How do you discern what is of middling importance, what is of timeless importance, what is sort of, new, what is not new, etc., etc. So I wanted to talk to somebody who'd actually done it, because at that point I was in my mid-20s and I wasn't really, experienced enough to discern what made for good writing. And Buford told me a few things. I mean, some of them were kind of very basic, saying, it needs to take your breath away, it needs to be original, electrifying, one sentence needs to make you want to read the next sentence, and so on. Stuff like that. Very basic stuff. But it was useful to know, and it actually shaped my own taste, which is why it was important.
So there are two things that Buford does in Granta, which you haven't done in your anthology. One is he has also included in quite a few editions the beginnings of a novel by a writer. And also he's got some essays also in some of the Granta magazines. You haven't done this in your anthology. You've defined it quite differently. Why? I want you to answer both these questions. Why not essays which are like short stories, and why not the beginnings of a novel or a bigger piece?
It's a very good question. It's basically the kind of boundaries I decided to set for these two anthologies. I wanted it to be short fiction, no more, no less. My company publishes other books that include non-fiction, which include excerpts from novels, and that's a completely acknowledged and important genre, because it shows you a range of literary writing. It gives you a glimpse of a certain literature at a certain point in time. I wanted to narrow it down because, we have such an embarrassment of riches. It would have got unmanageable to have all of these other genres, which is non-fiction and full-length novels, excerpts from novels. So I decided to keep it to short fiction in English and in translation.
But David, this question comes up again and again, and I'm going to ask you again, what is a short story?
Well, in the introduction, I talk about it, and maybe I'll just read a little passage
Yes.
to give you an idea. So there's a writer called George Saunders, a very good short story writer and also a novelist, and he won the Booker a couple of years ago. And he talks about an encounter with Bill Buford, who we just spoke about, and he asked Bill Buford what he liked about short fiction, specifically Saunders' short fiction. And here's what Bill says. Well, I read a line and I like it enough to read the next. And that was it, his entire short story aesthetic, and presumably that of the magazine he worked for. And it's perfect. A story is a linear temporal phenomenon. It proceeds and charms us or doesn't, a line at a time. We have to keep being pulled into a story in order for it to do anything for us. I'll also quote one of our very own great short story writers, Ruskin Bond, who says, "Stories should flow like a stream of water, preferably a mountain stream. You will, of course, encounter boulders, but you will learn to go over them or around them so that your flow is unimpeded."
Right. Okay. So you have also described the process of doing this anthology, and you call it Sublime Goan Fenny, which I like and which I've had actually, because it's got to be distilled a few times, not the ones that you get in the shops. So what was the process? I mean, certainly one can't expect you to know all the Indian languages and select the best writers, and always they are not available in translation. So what was the process which you felt comfortable about?
Well, there were two ways one could have gone about it. One could have written to people one knew of and said, write an original story for the anthology. But that was not my intention. I mean, a lot of these writers are not well known. I mean, a lot of them are just starting out. So I wanted to go to places where they had published already. So there was already an initial filter, which was the editors of those magazines had decided that they were going to publish these stories, so they were good enough for those editors. So that was the first filter. The second filter was my colleagues, who are all very well read, and some referees that I approached to say, look, tell me which of these stories you think are worthy to, get to the next level. So that was the second filter. And the third filter was my own kind of understanding and appreciation of these stories. So they went through three filters to make it to the book.
And you're happy with the response that you've got to the anthology?
Yeah, the response has been sort of pretty much uniformly good. And more importantly for me as a publisher, I think, yes, there will be good books that don't sell, but in my experience, most books that are of any worth actually sell pretty decently. It might be that marketing has failed them, so they don't get to the attention of readers, but if readers know about them, they're willing to sort of buy. And this book has worked quite well, so to my mind, it succeeded on many fronts, critically as well as commercially.
That's great. It's great to hear that a book is doing well, and especially an anthology about which people have so many comments to make. This has been included, that's been dropped, is doing well and is accepted. So that's fantastic. You write about cultural arbiters and cultural cringe in the introduction, and you talk about it in other places. Who are these cultural arbiters that you have in mind? Who are these people?
Well, let me start with cultural cringe. For many years, especially at the beginning of my career, and when I worked outside India as well, in certain ex-colonies, 2 generations ago, my grandfather's generation had no option but to mold themselves to the tastes of the British, because we were a subject race. to get ahead, you had to conform. Unfortunately, what then happened, you had a couple more generations which carry that baggage. So you had to be feted or approved of in London or in New York before you're taken seriously here in English. I mean, obviously, our regional languages, they had their own kind of reasons for, for being approved of. But in English, it was very difficult in the early years of English language publishing for the general reader for anybody to take you seriously. If you looked at the bestseller list, they were dominated by British writers and American writers. It took us, I mean, all those of us who were working in publishing and who were writing, etc. So if a writer was published in London, that writer was then deemed to be great. Forget the fact that often British editors and American editors didn't know what they were choosing beyond, in terms of authenticity and so on. I think it's like me sitting here and saying, I think this writer from Minnesota is the best thing that part of America has produced. Of course I don't know that. I have certain abilities from my experience in terms of judging style and that kind of thing. But in terms of authenticity, in terms of realism, etc., it's best that the works of fiction are judged closest to their point of origin. This was something that was not happening in India for a long time. Now the situation is completely changed around. Our newspapers, our social media, our bookstores, our bestseller lists are all dominated by books written by Indians, which is fabulous. It's the way it should be. You go to New Zealand and there's a New Zealand writer who's any good, that writer is going to be chosen over, I don't know, a Croatian writer. And that's the way it should be here as well. So I think we're getting out of the cultural cringe thing. There might be still some remnants of it, but not too much. Now, cultural arbiters are, I think, necessary. Gatekeepers are necessary because otherwise, as a reader, how am I going to know what of the literally tens of thousands of books published every year that I'm going to put my money on, devote my attention to, etc., etc. Some of these gatekeepers and cultural arbiters are good. A lot of them are not very good. So they're what they are. I mean, if you're lucky, you have newspapers, blogs, websites, publishing companies, magazines that are good sort of filters or good ways to showcase what the best writing is. But as with anything, you're going to have vested interests, you're going to have semi-literate kind of judges, etc., etc. It's what it is.
I mean, Barry also spoke about, in a way, cultural arbitration, and decisions are made here now, not decisions made outside. And we believe in what's happening here and what we are doing and how we are writing and how we are behaving. So also when you look at all these creative writing courses or the English honors courses in different universities, you see a very lovely change in the curriculum where you have Indian writers, you have in Jadavpur University there's a department of comparative literature which started a long time back, and they have writers from all over India. The English honors curriculum is also very different from it was when you only had Beowulf and Chaucer. Nothing against them. I love reading all of that, but the whole curriculum and all of it has changed. But I wanted to come to the question of creative writing courses, and there are so many now, not only in India, but everywhere around the world. In fact, India was late in taking up creative writing courses in the bachelor's degree. Do you think that creative writing courses produce writers?
As with most things, there are good creative writing courses and there are bad creative writing courses. I think most creative writing courses are not very good. I think the best creative writing courses are those which have very, very stringent selection procedures before you can get into them, like Iowa, for example, or the University of East Anglia, which also has a great creative writing program. I think the best creative writing courses have students of a very high standard. That's people who've already done work which is good. And then you have the peer review where they all sit around and criticize each other's work, not in terms of, yeah, you know, this is the way you should write, but this is what worked for me, and this is what didn't work for me, etc., etc. So it's a very kind of interactive, organic process. There is no prescriptive thing going on, because I think if you want to be a writer, especially a creative writer, you need to do a lot of prep before you write a single word. There are no, I mean, you know, the kind of epic writer Dante said, God dictates and I write. I think that kind of pact has sort of disappeared a long time ago. I think you have to work and work and work and work at your writing before you even publish a single word. And that is the problem today in India. You know, because of the current dispensation in many parts of the country where you have semi-literate people sitting in charge, they are actually saying, to hell with culture, to hell with literary heritage, everybody's equal. No, you're not equal in terms of literature and the creation of literature. So it's at a discount at the moment. Hopefully it'll rebound, but which is why you see, that's one of the things, plus the fact that social media and online, anyone can put up anything, and if you have 100 likes on Facebook or on, you know, Twitter or on whatever it is that you, social media site you have a certain validation which has nothing to do with critical appreciation or critical inquiry into the excellence of your work. So anyway, the point I'm trying to make is, in order to be a writer, you don't need to take a creative writing course. I think you need to read as widely and as deeply as possible to hone your own creative instincts. You have to read the masters. You have to understand what the masters are trying to do before you even attempt a word of creative writing. You don't need a literature degree. You don't need a creative writing course, but you need to be steeped in literature before you're going to be able to create literature. That's what I think.
Thank you. So about translation, you have written about it. Now, Sahitya Academy started a translation series many, many years ago, before anybody else could get into it. Some of the translations were good, some were not that good, but they did do that translation series. And then Katha came in, then others got in. Now a lot of publishers say that, yeah, we must get into the Hindi belt, or we must get into the Kannada belt because there's great writing, you know. And these have been traditional English publishers. Is it because of the market, or is it because these books are actually selling internationally? Because a Bengali writer who's translated would expect to be sold, yes, to some parts of India, but should also be sold internationally. What is happening to Indian writing in translation? What is the quality of translation available today? What do you see coming in the next few years?
Well, let's start with the quality of translation. As you said, the Sahitya Academy has had a rather, it was a very good effort, but a very patchy effort. Most of the translations were, to be honest, quite appalling, you know. Today, translation is having its moment in India. Practically every publisher of any consequence has books of translation on their lists. I can tell you unambiguously that most of them are not working, you know, because publishers are often like sheep. Someone sort of, you know, starts, everyone else will follow, and I'll give you a good example of this. In the 1990s, dozens of Indian writers got published in England, especially, because you had Rushdie had won the Booker, Roy had won the Booker, and Kiran Desai had won the Booker. So they said, wow, I mean, India is a land of literary geniuses. We all should have an Indian book on our list. So they paid a ton of money. A few Indian writers got very lucky. And then inevitably, most of these books failed because they had not won the Booker or were not of the kind of quality of some of the best Indian writing available. And after that, it became very difficult to get published outside. So that answers your second question. How much of this is going outside? Practically nothing. What does happen today, which didn't happen 20 years ago, is because of Amazon and because of Kindle, if a writer has fans or people are following Indian writing outside, they can download, if rights are made available in other countries, you can download the book onto your iPad, phone, whatever, which didn't exist earlier. But in terms of Indian writing being sort of disseminated abroad, very little of it does.
Okay, coming back to this a case of Indian marvels, tell me about the sensibilities of these writers. I mean, these are unique stories, and they also have a different sensibility to the earlier writers around India, from India. Tell me a little bit about what you thought about these millennials and under 40s and the kind of way they write, the themes they choose, the topic they are interested in.
Sujata,
Well, to start with, I think...
I'm sorry for the interruption, we have about 5 to 10 minutes more.
To start with, I think it's very encouraging to see so many talented writers from all over the country, actually. Once upon a time, the writer in English tended to be found in the big cities, in the 4 or 5 big metros. Now they're from everywhere. You know, a lot of them are from small towns. They're from every part of the country. And what was particularly kind of interesting to me, because I like fiction to be grounded in the political reality of the day. You know, I like, without being didactic or preachy, because then the fiction is not very good, but to give you a deeper understanding of what you see on the on television, read in the newspapers, to give you to sink you deeper into the reality of the country, which is what I think one of the purposes of good fiction is, or one of the characteristics of good fiction. So there are some extremely good stories here, and that's very encouraging to see in young people. And I don't mean this in a patronizing way, but I mean this in the sense of if you are on social media. Now I've got off most of my social media accounts. A lot of that chatter is completely and utterly brainless, you know. But clearly there are young people who are thinking very deeply, because they are really the future of this country. You know, I think today we're passing through a rather terrible time, but I believe this too shall pass, and there need to be people to pick up the reins or whatever, to pick up the baton and run with it. And that was one of the things I found in this anthology. Lots and lots of really smart, really talented, really concerned and original voices, of whom we'll hear a lot more in the years to come.
Thank you, David, for including them. And also I salute these brave voices. They're very, very brave. And they're speaking out and saying things which a lot of people will not be able to say in any platform. And they've said it in writing, and you've included that in the anthology. Just 1 or 2 questions more, and then I think I'll satisfy Nayantara over there. One question is about, is the short story the equivalent of the OTT, films and OTT? And people don't like to read long novels, so they'd rather read a short story. Actually, it has happened. Bengali publishers have told me. Choto golpo onek beshi taratari bikri hoy. I don't know whether it's, I mean, certainly if publishers here are telling me that, I would have to believe that. What do you think? Is it the OTT? You know,
this is a well-worn perception that the different readerships for short fiction and novels, but in the past it was in the reverse direction. People said, no, you know, you should write novels, short stories don't sell, because people don't, you know, I don't know what the kind of, there was no scientific method there. And to be honest, I'm quite puzzled by it, because I have no idea why that should be so. I read short stories for a certain reason. I read a novel for another reason, because a novel takes up a lot more of my time. There are certain things that I look for in a novel when I read a novel, but they're entirely different modes of creation. It's like saying, why is Usain Bolt not Alberto Salazar? Why can't he run the marathon? He can't. I mean, he runs a certain kind of race. The other guy runs a different kind of race. And they're both equally glorious to somebody who likes to watch runners. So, honestly, I think the only thing that matters is excellence. If you are at the top of your game, if you've written an outstanding book, whether it's a novel or a collection of short stories, it's going to work to a greater or lesser extent. And that's the only yardstick I use. I mean, I publish very little fiction now because I think we're passing through a fairly sterile period where fiction is concerned. You know, once upon a time you had great novelists and short story writers coming out of the years. Today, not as much. So that is the only criterion I follow.
How many hours do you read every day?
I read rather fewer hours a day now because I actually work very hard on the books I edit, which I didn't used to do earlier because, you know, at Aleph we boast that we publish the best Indian books in the world, and I want to make sure it's not an idle boast, so I work really, really hard, so I can't read as much as I used to. But I would say I buy 4 or 5 books a week because I'm a book junkie. I don't read all of them. Hopefully I'll find the time to read all of them at one point.
No, I hope more and more books get sold. I hope the bookstores come back again in full flow. I think that's what we need, because as you go outside India, you'll see bookstores again have big crowds. And that's what we need here. Lots of people reading books, and they will read if they have an anthology like this, which has brilliant stories by under 40s and brilliant new sensibilities. Thank you, David.
Thank you very much.
Great honor to have you here.
It's great to be here.
And we hope we'll get you here more frequently, and maybe next year and the year after.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, it's time for our next session. What does it take to knit together emotions, ideas, questions, and perspectives into words and ultimately stories for the first time? The next session, called The Novel and the New, will witness authors from across the world, fiction writer Ifat Nawaz, filmmaker and author Bernard Camel, Anupama Mohan, share their thoughts with columnist and fellow author Joshudhara Chakraborty. Dhaka-born and based in Pondicherry, Ifat Nawaz worked as a humanitarian and development worker alongside writing for 10 years for Bangladesh's English newspaper, The Daily Star. The Bangladeshi-American writer's debut work of fiction, Shurjo's Clan, gives readers an evocative exploration of grief, loss, displacement, and identity. Bernard Camel is an Austrian author, designer, film director, and founder of a transdisciplinary art institution. His novella, set in and around Kafkaesque Vienna and called Snow White, is a fast-paced thriller teeming with exciting twists and turns. Anupama Mohan is a poet, academic, and short story writer. Her debut novel, Where Mayflies Live Forever, is a gripping mystery and a story about one woman's self-discovery in the natural world. A columnist, translator, executive, and teacher, Joshudhara Chakraborty is the author of 2 books, the best-selling The Word Keepers and Sky Serpents, the first 2 books in the Word Keepers trilogy. May I please ask our panelists to come onto the stage.